Hi gang, Rob here. It's the evening of 9 January 2017 and I'm coming back to you with a a much requested and anticipated final update video on the Spyderco Advocate. Knife with jacked up ball bearing pivot and ridiculously thin backing washers. Reference my two prior videos on this knife, and I will link them in annotation and in description. The first knife was my initial review in which I was basically raved about the knife. Had some concerns about gritty action and thought it was just about grinder marks on the blade tang and the detent ball. It turned out to be a horrible pivot mechanism. Ball bearings that were peening into very thin, flimsy backing washers and just causing all kinds of havoc with action and centering and etc. So today is Monday, January 9th. I think I posted my not recommended video on Sunday night, maybe New Year's night, January 1st. I told you that I would try to contact Spyderco the next day. They were closed on Monday. I did talk to customer service on Tuesday, January 2nd. Told them who I was. They had gotten into work that morning and they had seen that social media was absolutely on fire, and I don't mean in a good way, about this knife. They had already watched my video. I don't know, they seemed like they were oblivious to the problem before last Tuesday morning. I don't really know how they could have been oblivious given the issues with the Domino and the Mantra and the Southern that had percolated through forums and social media before the release of the Advocate, which really exposed the weaknesses in their ball bearing pivot. But and again, they prototyped this knife about June of 2016. Nobody noticed in 6 months that the pivot suspension and bearing system sucked. I'm not sure how to take that. Anyway, so they were going to have a meeting last Tuesday, and I really haven't. I haven't been waiting with bated breath for some public statement from Spyderco. All they could tell me at that point was, there's one thing we can do. The only thing we can do is if you want to send your knives in, we can install new washers and bearings. So their solution, Spyderco's solution to not a material problem or a machining or tolerancing problem, but an engineering flaw where a material of a given shape and thickness has been spec'd for a knife that has no hope of performing as desired. Their solution to that isn't to make any engineering change or retrofit to your knife, but they'll be happy to supply more parts just like the first ones that were doomed to fail. I hope they thought a little bit more about it afterward. That's not an acceptable answer from a company like Spyderco. I will say this, and let's sort of get into what I've learned in the week that's passed since I made that video. Some guys have seen the peen marks from the ball bearings in the washers, and they've decided that the way to make those go away is to sort of an over-the-top solution. Let's roll form the washers more. Let's crank down on the pivot as hard as we can, and we'll work the knife for an hour, and we will roll form out the peen marks from the ball bearings. And I tell you, I did that, and it does work. There is, however, a side effect. The length of the pivot, the female side of the pivot, well, it's actually a barrel. I can only get this screw out. The other one's red Loctited in, won't move. Bravo, Spyderco. Sarcasm alert. So here's what I learned. I ran out of room. I've crushed these washers so much that when I tighten down this screw, it runs into the top of the pivot, the pivot barrel. So right now it's cranked full tight. I have no side play, but if I roll form these washers anymore, I'm done. I have no more adjustment in my pivot, and I have no more adjustment. So if these bearings dig into these washers anymore and make them even thinner, spread them out and make them curl anymore, I'm going to have side play in this knife, and I have a $221 what? Safe Queen paperweight? You tell me. Yeah, so here's the problem as best I can explain it. The reason that this model seems to have more problems with the deformation of the backing washers and the ball bearing pivot than the other knives isn't because the pivot's been over tightened. It's because, as all the Gale Bradley models have, the knife has robust lock bar tension and a detent ball that is quite a ways. You know, if you drew a ray from the center of the pivot out, from where the last ball bearing is to where the ball detent is, it's the forces are cantilevered outside that ring of ball bearings by a great deal. So lots of force, long lever. When the knife is sitting closed on your desk, the lock bar, under a lot of tension when it's in its fully extended position, is putting 1 or 2 or 3 peen marks in the washer, just resting on the ball bearings, pushing on the ball bearings. That gives you a gritty feeling when you close the knife. Mine's less gritty now, and it's less gritty, but because I know in my mind that this knife is just sitting here eating itself up, it's very hard for me to have a positive emotional connection to it. You know, I think about this knife versus a knife like the Chris Reeve Sebenza that I'm confident, because I've owned several and worked on 100 maybe, I'm confident that properly maintained, these knives will be around for a generation or two without having to change any parts. This knife will eat backing washers and probably ball bearings, and you know, it'll probably need new ones in a year, 2 years. How long are they going to make them? Who knows? Very disappointing. Very disappointing. While I was contemplating my washer project, and by the way, I did order washers, and I tried to convert this knife to a phosphor bronze washer pivot. I ordered some 20 thousandths thick and some 15 thousandths thick washers from Midwest Knife Maker. The 20 thousandths ones were going to work if they hadn't had horrendous burrs and been terribly out of flat. Guys, if you're making folders, don't order phosphor bronze washers from Midwest Knife Maker Supply, which I believe is affiliated with USA Knife Maker, because that's the site I was on, and my washers shipped not from USA but from Midwest. These are garbage, absolute garbage. I had to sand on them so much to get them flat and deburred that the thickness is varied, and they still weren't flat. And I can't tell you if a phosphor bronze washer conversion is going to work on this knife or not. It might, if you got washers the right thickness that were flat. I can tell you this: I did some light surface sanding on the insides of the handle scales from here forward on 600 grit paper on glass, and they cleaned right up, so there's no flatness issue there. So I I just wish I could have bought washers that didn't. I mean, these are, I don't know what these are good for, but they're not good in a knife pivot. They're junk. I guess if you lapped every washer, they'd be, you could use them then, maybe, I don't know. So scrap that. We're back to original equipment. I had an idea, just because this knife is so stiff, perceptibly, in closing compared to other ball bearing pivot knives that I've used. I thought, well, you know, the knife flips great. It's got a robust detent, a properly designed flipper. It's not free or smooth, but it flips great. You know, why have we given up on the idea of flippers and washers, phosphor bronze washers? You know, is the force required to open or close them so much greater that we have to use ball bearings? And you know, this doesn't even feel like ball bearings. It feels like gritty phosphor bronze or something. But so I decided to do a little test between this knife, another ball bearing knife, and two washer knives, just to see how much force is required to close the blade with the lock bar and detent ball engaging the blade tang. You know, is a ball bearing knife that much freer? It is. We know it's freer if we do this, right? If we take the lock bar all the way off the blade, we know they'll fall just free. We know that. But wait a minute. So does that. Interesting. So let's take a look now at a little test I put together on force required or torque required to close knife blades with two separate style pivots. Take a look. Okay guys, I'm going to measure the force required to close the blade at the tip. You can see my digital scale with a piece of duct tape right in the middle. I use a piece of duct tape just to kind of hold the tip in place. What I'm going to do is I'm going to close each one of these knives from 90 degrees till just before the detent drops in the hole. And you know, we'll kind of keep an eye on the display and try to record sort of an average reading of the force required to close the knife over that range. And then I've also measured the length from the tip of the knife to the pivot on each of the four knives we're going to test, so we can convert that to ounce inches, so the length of our blade won't affect the data. We're going to compensate and turn that raw pounds of force or raw ounces of force into ounce inches to compensate for the length of the lever. Make sense? Okay. First we're going to test the Spyderco Advocate, and we'll close them like 3 times and we'll kind of try to arrive at an average. Okay, so 90 degrees open, tip in the middle, and here we go. What do you think about 2.1? Maybe we'll call it 2.0. We'll record 2.0 for the Advocate. Next, we're going to do 2 washer knives. And one of them, the Chris Reeve Sebenza 21, this one in Wilson Combat Star Benza trim. And I chose the Sebenza on purpose because it's sort of the paradox of the folding knife world. People regard the Sebenza as extremely smooth, but it has a lot of lock bar tension, so it's not a particularly free knife, at least we don't think so, with the lock bar touching the blade tang. So let's measure on the Sebenza. We'll do it 3 times as well, starting at 90 degrees. That's about 2.3 all the way through its arc. And a second time. And we'll call that 2.3. And has just a little bit longer lever, 4 inches on the Advocate, 4 1/8 on the Sebenza. So our ounce inches are going to be a little higher. Now this ought to be interesting. I chose this one for a reason too. Spyderco Gale Bradley 2, one of the smoothest, freest washer knives I own. Let's limber him up a little bit. Okay. There we go. I don't know, guys, what'd you think? I'm not sure that first test was real accurate. Let's call him 2.4. And now we're going to try the Lion Steel Kerr, which I chose because it's a bearing knife and one that, at least perceptibly, is very smooth and free. So let's see what it does for us here. Oh, I was way far away from the tip. Start over. Okay. So what do you think, guys, about? Let's call that 1.7. So I'm going to tally up my ounce inches and we'll kind of take a look at where these 4 stack up. Be right back. Okay. So let's take a look, guys. And this grid shows the 4 knives, the length from the tip to the pivot, the weight in ounces on the tip in order to move the blade in a closed direction, and then ounce inches, which is the amount of torque compensating for the length of the lever from tip to pivot. So this sort of equals the playing field based on length. So the knife that required the least force to close with lock bar on blade tang was the Kerr, 6.59 ounce inches. Second place, but gosh, 1.5 ounce inches above the Kerr was the Advocate at 8.0. And then the Sebenza, shockingly, at 9.49 ounce inches, a little better than the Gale Bradley 2. So my point really isn't to rank these 4 knives, but more or less to show you there's not a whole lot of difference if these knives are set up and operating correctly between a pretty good bearing knife and a really good washer knife in the amount of force required to move the blade with the blade tang or with the detent ball under lock bar pressure on the blade tang. My point for doing that was to see if my hunch was correct, and I kind of think it was. If we built the Spyderco Advocate on a very precise washer system like the Gale Bradley 2, would it be a good flipper knife? I think the answer is yes. Even with the jacked up Midwest Knife Supply warped bird washers that really disappointed me because I don't feel like I was able to really see what this knife was going to be like on good washers. Even with those, I could make it flip well. It took a lot of effort to close, and I had blade play side to side. But even with kind of jacked up action, because of the stiff detent and the properly designed flipper tab, the knife flipped well on washers. So anyway, Back with some conclusions in a minute. Okay, so what are my conclusions? Well, and I hope my bias in looking for a solution didn't color the type of test I did, or it didn't color the results. I know that the results are the results, but I think the test is valid. You know, does the ball bearing pivot give us a significantly reduced amount of torque required to close and open a knife blade with the lock bar engaging the blade tang over phosphor bronze washers, that it makes the washer knife not viable in a flipper setup and the bearing pivot necessary in a flipper setup? Well, you know, these numbers are not, they're not hugely different. You know, the best knife at 6.5 ounce-inches of force required to move the blade under tension from the lock bar to the worst knife, you know, it's a 50% increase, but it's still a small number. I mean, nobody would grab a Gale Bradley 2 and think, man, it takes a ton of force to move that blade. You know, with very little effort and very little risk, it can be thumbed out. It can be spidey flicked out. So if I had a strong detent ball and a well-designed flipper tab, would it flip well? You bet it would. And let's remember, guys, when most of the flipper knives on washers that we saw didn't flip well, you know, if they weren't assisted and they didn't have ball bearings, just a washer and a flipper, if you remember, when that was in vogue before the advent of the ball bearing pivot, what else did we see? We saw weak detents. You know, we saw thumb stud detents on flipper knives. Now we have detent balls with bearings that, if we have our fingers on the lock bar, we can't even open the knife. So it's not the freeness and smoothness of the ball bearings that make these knives flip well. It's the abrupt breaking of the detent that makes them flip well. With the possible exception of the Kerr, which is just a beautiful knife. So given the mechanical potential problems that ball bearing pivots give us, is it worth building knives with flippers and ball bearings? Can we just, I really want to see somebody build a titanium frame lock or robust liner lock flipper on phosphor bronze washers with a strong detent and on washers, because I bet you it's going to be a great knife. You know, imagine a knife, for instance, like the ZTO 550. I would have loved to have one of those in the test, because I bet it would have been right up there with the Kerr. You know, give it a robust detent and a flipper, I think it's a rocket, and it probably lasts forever. Anyway, that's enough of that. So final word, final conclusions on the Spyderco Advocate. I don't know if it's going to be for sale or not. I really, since I own all 4 Gale Bradley folders from Spyderco, do I really want to sell this knife? I don't think I do. I love so much about it. I think I'm going to call Golden and see if they'll send me, I don't know, maybe 2 sets of bearings and washers, so I have spares for over the years. Maybe I'll even pay for them. I don't know. I'm not mad at Spyderco. I'm just really disappointed. I'm not demanding my money back. I'm not demanding them take the knife back under warranty, even though I've had it apart, I don't know, 7 or 8 freaking times. I'm just disappointed. It's a knife that I loved and anticipated between prototype and production. I was so excited to get it and so let down at such a poor engineering decision. I don't know. Guys are living with the pivot. It seems to be getting smoother if you do what I described earlier in the video. Mine's smoother. It is. You guys be the judge on this one. An absolutely wonderful piece of folding cutlery except for this issue. That's all for this one, my friends. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. And remember the word. And my poor flipping advocate are sharp.